at the Chan Division of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy at the University of Southern California. She received her Bachelor of Science and Master of Arts degrees in Occupational Therapy from the University of Southern California and her Doctor of Philosophy and Occupational Science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Prior to her 2018 appointment to the USC Chan Division of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy, she was a tenured associate professor in the Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy at St. Louis University. Her research and scholarship focus on how sociopolitical influences shape occupational participation, particularly in situations of unemployment or precarious employment. Her work has contributed to critiques and expansions of theoretical and conceptual foundations in both occupational science and occupational therapy. Her research has been supported by internal funding at St. Louis University and the University of Southern California, as well as external funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. She has published extensively in peer-reviewed occupational science and occupational therapy journals and textbooks, and has received awards for her writing, including the Canadian Association of Occupational Therapists 2015 Golden Quill Award, for mentoring, including the American Occupational Therapy Association 2015 Mentoring Award, and scholarly contributions, including the Canadian Society of Occupational Scientists 2023 Townsend and Politachko Lectureship. Her current research projects focus on third places in the lives of retired and precariously employed workers, as well as the return to work process for people with post-COVID conditions. Dr. Antoine Bailliard is an associate professor of occupational therapy at Duke University. He earned his MS in occupational therapy and his PhD in occupational science here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research focuses on exploring how sensory processing patterns affect community integration and participation in meaningful occupations. His community-engaged scholarship focuses on improving the delivery of community-based services for adults with serious mental illness. His theoretical work focuses on expanding understandings of occupational justice to enhance inclusion and understandings of how sensory processing patterns affect meaningful participation. Dr. Bailliard uses participatory methods to partner with people with lived experience with mental illness to design and implement research activities, and in the development of tools and programs that improve the health, well-being, meaningful participation, and community integration of persons with serious mental illness. Dr. Bailliard's clinical experience spans from working in acute inpatient mental health, chronic inpatient mental health, and community-based mental health settings. Currently, Dr. Bailliard is co-principal investigator of a 5-year, $2.4 million federal grant from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration to design an innovative, assertive outreach team to meet the needs of adults with serious mental illness who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. Dr. Bailliard is also a consultant for the Public Mental Health Partnership between the LA County Department of Mental Health and UCLA. He is also a consultant and trainer for the Institute for Best Practices at the Center for Excellence in Community Mental Health at UNC Chapel Hill. Please join me in welcoming Drs. Aldrich and Bailliard.
All right, I think everybody can hear me.
Oh, that's us. Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have you here. And I've got to say, for me, it's really great to be back at UNC, and it feels very fitting to be giving this lecture with Antoine. So as you heard, we were the first 2 PhD students in this program, and we did many things together as a result of that. So I think we took all but one of the same courses together. And we went together to ask Virginia Dickey, who's in the middle here, pictured with our graduation cake, if she would supervise our respective dissertations. And you might think that this kind of a situation where we're doing everything together and we're together all the time might breed competitiveness, but really nothing could be further from the truth. So we were cheerleaders and champions for each other, and we really tried to ensure that our experiences were balanced against each other. And we've always really gotten along, despite being very different people. So an example of this is at the beginning of the doctoral program, the first month, I wrote a list on one piece of paper of everything I had to do before graduation, and I put it up in our office. He did not appreciate this. And that's because we have, say, different timelines for preparation and thinking about things. And so when we were invited jointly to give this lecture, we knew the biggest challenge would be determining how to balance our different presentation and preparation styles.
Yes, so I couldn't agree with you more. It's been a real pleasure working with you, but yeah, our working styles were different and we had to accommodate that. So I had to start preparing for this much earlier than I normally would. You know, they're very different styles. Not one's better than the other. It's just one fits the person and, you know, and the other one fits me. So then yeah, so in preparing for this, we also were talking about, would it make sense for us, you know, to get up and give a single talk and then, you know, another person give up another talk? It just didn't make sense. It felt very artificial. So we felt like we should actually engage more of a conversational style. So that's what this talk is going to be like. It's going to be a conversation between us where we're going to have some slides to guide what we're saying, and we're going to be asking each other questions. And then just a little bit of a different format, right? Not so, quite so lecture based. And then at the end, we definitely want to leave some time for discussion. So we know that, you know, the stuff we're talking about is really, there's so much to say. We could spend, you know, an hour on each slide, and we can't do that. So see this as also as an invitation to contact us after to, you know, deepen some of these conversations a little bit more, because we're really just going to be scratching the surface. So yeah, we will, well, that's it, actually. Yeah.
And one other thing, as we do try to sort of keep pace with the time that we have with you. If you see me checking my watch, it's not because I want to leave, it's because I want to make sure we leave time for questions at the end.
Right.
So as we move towards sharing our ideas, we do want to acknowledge where our doctoral journey began and where this lecture is taking place this evening. So the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill was built by enslaved Africans and their descendants on the unceded homelands of the Occaneechi, Shakori, Eno, and Sissipaha peoples. And we acknowledge that these diverse peoples and their histories are intimately intertwined with our own ongoing processes of learning and unlearning, and that our respective constellations of identities have long been afforded positions of privilege here. We acknowledge and pay respect to these unsung founders and land custodians, and we recognize that their dispossession and trauma cannot be overlooked in the story of how and why we are speaking here with you today.
So before we begin, I just want to introduce a couple of concepts, policy and political, right? This is something that's really kind of, as you know by the topic, this is kind of the core of what we're talking about today, but I just wanted to clarify things, make sure we're on the same page. When we're talking about policy, we're not just talking about, you know, US government policy. I mean, that's certainly a piece of it, but we're talking about policy at all levels, even unspoken policies. They're more kind of like these understandings of ways of doing. And so the policies that we're referring to are at the organizational level, the institutional level, and certainly, you know, municipal government level, state government levels. It's all of these kind of understandings that this is how things should happen, both explicit and implicit. And when we're talking about political, it's very much related. We're not talking about, you know, Democrats, Republicans. We're talking about political in the sense of power and who has it and who's able to make decisions and make things truth, so to speak. So it's really more of a, you know, Foucauldian, Bailliard approach on thinking about political, how, you know, power is unequally distributed and that it gives some people the right to do things and change things and others not. So a lot of this, we're going to be discussing about how systems are negotiated, reproduced, or challenged through doings, and that's that political piece that we're talking about. So I think the best way for us to start talking about this, you know, we started both as occupational scientists, and we shared that common theoretical ground and understanding based on, you know, on Dewey and the transactional perspective. And that's really informed both of our career trajectories. So the question that we're going to start with is, what does occupational science allow us to see?
And so one of the ways that we wanted to reflect on this as we were talking with each other is to think of examples in our work where we felt occupational science allowed us to see something new or to see something in a new light. So in my doctoral research on discouraged workers, which is a subset of people who are outside the formal workforce, one of the things that I came to learn about was something called resource seeking. And resource seeking is defined as encompassing a range of activities focused on securing income supplements, goods, and services to meet basic survival needs. Resource seeking was something that I saw a lot of discouraged workers engaging in, but it's really much broader than that because everyone engages in resource seeking of some form or another. And so in coming to sort of name and frame this occupation, and occupational science foregrounding this occupation really helped us do that. Co-authors of mine and I argued that there's a narrow normative view of work that informs occupational therapy, and that makes other forms of work invisible. And this could be because those forms of work are outside socially approved ways of supporting oneself and one's family. And we all have experienced broader changes to society and the economy. And in recognition of the fact that most households combine multiple income strategies to support themselves and their families, we argued that there's a greater need for a focus on an understanding of resource seeking as an occupation. And that needs to be both for occupational therapists in terms of their practices, but also for occupational scientists in terms of the kinds of occupations that they might make visible. So what I want to do is just share two brief stories of how resource seeking appeared in my doctoral research to give you an idea of what this looks like on the ground. So there's a picture here with a clock. These pictures were taken where I did my doctoral research. And so I'm going to tell you about Margie. And so Margie lost her job as a high finance banker. And in response to that, she took a paid AmeriCorps volunteer position instead of seeking reemployment because there were no other jobs in that geographic region in her industry. I should also note that this was right when the Great Recession was its most severe. So jobs in general were difficult to come by. So she told me, I'm still below the poverty line, even with my unemployment and the stipend. I'm eligible for food stamps, housing assistance, pretty much anything that the federal, state, and local government allows. So I went from a six-figure income to being below the poverty line, and I still have the same bills. So Margie told me a lot about this process of seeking resources, and she said it was an eye-opening experience. And quote, I thought financial aid for college was a humbling experience, an experience that was somewhat degrading. This was probably 25 times worse. And Margie estimated that she spent at least 15 hours per month submitting paperwork or attending meetings to maintain her eligibility for these various resources. So then there's Rose, this picture here with the chair. She was a former factory worker, and she had developed a complex system to ensure her family had enough food to eat. On the basis of her household income, she qualified for food stamps, as well as a twice-a-month allocation from 2 different community food pantries. And these food pantry workers determined what food Rose actually received. So she couldn't go in and choose the actual food items. But she said that this sort of situation of decreased choice actually inspired her own creativity. And she told me, we've come up with some pretty creative meals that you wouldn't think about fixing, but they turn out to be really good. We take macaroni and cheese, put some tomatoes in it, brown some hamburger, put it in there. And Rose occasionally received food items from this food pantry that she did not want or need, and she donated those to an informal food pantry at her apartment complex. So the residents of the complex had sort of spontaneously created their own local food pantry. And she said that neighbors often shared purchased groceries with each other. So meat products that were wrapped individually and then wrapped together were purchased by one household, remainders were passed on to the next household, et cetera, et cetera. And the amount of the food that was available at the food pantry and the willingness of her neighbors to trade or barter food prompted spontaneity and creativity in Rose's efforts to create nutritious food for her family. So there are other folks in occupational therapy and occupational science who have focused on things like resource seeking. So Susan Magacy's work on negotiating social service systems is another piece of research that helps us think about these kinds of occupations. But in naming and framing this particular occupation, my co-authors and I really drew on occupational science to highlight the wisdom, creativity, and multiple governmental, community, and relational resources that people draw on to seek resources and to make ends meet. And then we discussed the ways in which the structure of the occupational therapy practice framework, which at that time was in its 3rd edition, did not make any of those occupations visible. They were not at all evident because we argued there was this unstated assumption that the document was structured around middle-class lives and experiences. And so after we published this article, I started hearing from occupational therapy practitioners who would say, this is what I do with the people I work with. I do this all the time, and I didn't have the language for it. I didn't have a way to make this visible, this part of my practice that was already going on. And so I think, that was really an aha moment for me, seeing how occupational science research could then inform occupational therapy practices or bolster them in some way. And I know that a lot of your work has involved people in precarious situations. And so I'm wondering if resource-seeking occupations kind of come into the work that you do and the ways in which they come into the work that you do.
So in preparing for this, we were talking about resource seeking, and it really just jumped into the foreground, basically how central this was to all the work I'm doing. In fact, so I run these bi-monthly consults for all the community mental health providers in North Carolina who are part of either ACT teams, transition to community living teams, community support teams, or IPS supported employment teams. And every time we end up discussing resource seeking. So we just had one last Tuesday, and for the entire hour, I was talking about resource seeking with this provider. So it's completely integral to what I do. So I work a lot with folks who, as Dr. Aldrich says, folks who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. And this is a central occupation to their everyday life. They are always trying to find resources, and they're actually really scrappy. Like, that's how people describe this group, that people are really amazing and resourceful in being able to cobble together all these resources. Because as you might know, the community system, it's completely scattered and it's not at all centralized. And so, no matter if you're working in one city as opposed to another, it's a totally different sense of resource seeking. So there's not one way to do it. And so it's always a central piece of our conversation, and I'm always bringing it up. And, as we kept preparing for this, I realized how much we were talking about it and how much I was actually taking it, making it an object, so to speak, something to consider. It wasn't something on the side. It was actually something really that we needed to focus on, because typically what happens, everyone's focusing on changing the individual. Everyone's focusing on trying to, rehabilitate this person, but they're not actually thinking about the bigger picture and how much coordination needs to happen. So it was a central occupation for the folks that I'm working with, for the community health workers, and also for the OTs in this complex care management program that I've had the incredible privilege of being a part of. This is a state-funded program where OTs have been hired across the state by each managed care organization to help OTRN teams go out and help folks who are living in adult care homes to transition them to independent living. And so I do a lot of consulting and training for this program and with all the OTs there. And guess what? Resource seeking comes up all the time for the OTs there. It's central to what they do too. But because it's not acknowledged by the OTPF, the Occupational Therapy Practice Framework, they're not necessarily focusing it as a central occupation and something that they need to do. And there's a lot of power in that word or that occupation not being in the practice framework. And because it's not, then students who come out, they're not necessarily prepared to think about resource seeking as an occupation. Students who are doing capstones are not necessarily prepared to think about this as being an integral part of what they do. Mentors of capstones are not necessarily prepared to mentor people through this incredibly complicated occupation that takes a long time to get good at. So, the more we talk about it and the more it keeps coming up in my work, the more I'm in agreement that this absolutely needs to be an occupation that's integrated into the OTPF. So OTs do this in a different way. You might think, okay, social workers get out there and they're the ones that do the resource seeking. They're the ones that plug everyone up to the services. And yes, they do a lot of that. But what OTs do is different. What we're doing is we're helping people engage in resource seeking themselves so that they can then seek, to perhaps not need the social worker, right? Or to actually, if they're doing it themselves, they're probably able to do it in a much more way that is much more attuned to their own needs. So like the OT absolutely offers a unique and incredibly important aspect to resource seeking that goes above and beyond what the social worker is doing. And I'm not saying it replaces it, but it is unique and it needs to be acknowledged and a part of our training, I would argue. So, excuse me. And so it's such that in HomeLink, the SAMHSA grant that we have, we just got refunded. And for the second 5 years, one of our deliverables is explicitly stating one of the things we do is to connect our clients to additional resources. And that's like one of the primary activities we do. Go ahead. So, with all that in mind, and then thinking about occupational science and like zooming out a little bit, really highlights how political these things are and how we need to be able to label these things so that they can become legitimate intervention targets that then become legitimate goals, for instance, to actually work on that are then acknowledged by the systems, right? So, when I think about how occupational science has affected my work, and it highlights this idea of the politics behind community mental health, what I do in my job is constantly advocate. I am constantly advocating and trying to change the system to focus more on things like meaningful participation, right? These are the things that we do as OTs and that we focus on that we know is like core to a person's well-being. We are constantly, at least I am constantly trying to shift the narrative away from symptoms and reducing symptomology, making a person more normative, and instead focusing more on this idea that, we really need to focus on occupation. We really need to focus on participation. So the occupational science, what it did is it allowed me to be radically into this idea of advocating occupation as a mechanism of health. I mean, I'm more than a squeaky wheel sometimes on this. Sometimes I'm the wheel that just like stops rolling and makes the cart screech. And sometimes you need to do that because everyone keeps going back to symptoms. And it's because they've been trained, it's this habitual way of thinking. And so I find that most of the work that I do is trying to break that habit of thinking to sensitize people to occupational science. I don't necessarily say occupational science, but I do use the term occupation and meaningful participation and really try to empower people to understand that this is an important thing to support people in doing and then help them do it as opposed to focusing again on symptoms. So, this involves nonstop negotiating policies, systems, and leadership and reimbursement structures, because you always get pushback. You always get people saying, yeah, well, that sounds great. I know that's important, but my team lead won't allow it, or I have this productivity that I have to meet. And so that's when you start pushing back against those things. And you're like, well, actually, that's not true. Yeah, productivity matters, but there are ways to get around that. And there are ways to, when you focus on meaningful participation and occupation, you actually get better outcomes. So you end up at the end goal faster. But that takes a lot of convincing and a lot of negotiating and non-stop relentless advocacy, being that screeching wheel on that cart. You don't always want to be that, but sometimes you really do need to do it. So yeah, it's convincing the leadership, convincing providers of occupation as a mechanism of health. And this middle bullet point, I think, is really important. This idea is that shift, that cognitive shift that folks have to go through away from medical care to occupational participation and occupational science. And it's starting to work. I just got invited to a statewide conference. I'm the only OT there, and I'm doing a lecture on occupational justice. And that's really exciting. So in your work, this stuff comes up all the time. Go ahead. This literally, this speaks directly to a concept that you've been working on for a while. And again, as we were talking about, I was like, this is what I do. And it's about street level bureaucracy.
Yeah, so one of the things that as I move forward with my career from the study of discouraged workers, broadening out to long-term unemployment and really drawing on more critical social theories to understand these kind of structures that we operate within, this idea of street level bureaucracy was really helpful to understand how policy gets quote unquote made on the street level, on the level of service provider interactions with service recipients. So this comes from work that I've done with Debbie LaLiberte-Rudman, who's a collaborator of mine at Western University. And really, I think a lot of what these theories did was help us foreground the situation and to see the whole situation through which occupation unfolds and is enacted. And so when we're talking about street level bureaucrats, one of the things that we're talking about is seeing how the work of frontline service providers is regulated by policy, and policy, again, being the broad definition that Antoine shared at the beginning of the presentation, but also where policy is made. So street level bureaucrats actually make policy through their interactions with service recipients. So in my research on long-term unemployment, this was the job counselors, this was the job developers and the job coaches. This was the people who may be noting that folks would be eligible for unemployment insurance. So they're making decisions about whether someone is or is not eligible for services based on institutional, organizational, federal, state policies that have been outlined. And examples of other straight level bureaucrats from Lipsky's research, and Lipsky was the person who coined this term originally, included police officers, teachers, and social workers. So obviously, we're going to see occupational therapists in that list. And one of the key pieces, and I should say that you can't see it maybe down here, but Hildenbrand and Silcock are two occupational therapists who also utilized this concept in their work to think about occupational therapists and how they're embedded in systems and structures. So one of the key pieces of Lipsky's writings about street level bureaucrats is this idea of discretion. And discretion refers to judgments and associated actions that street level bureaucrats take in a given situation when they are applying general guiding policies. So you can wield discretion as a frontline service provider in ways that reinforce existing policies and structures, challenge them, or transform them. And so Lipsky's work helped us think about how, in our study, frontline service providers wielded discretion to afford services, constrain services, change their systems, reinforce their systems. And we started thinking about the ways in which occupational therapists do this through their everyday practices. So it was this framing of street level bureaucracy and street level bureaucrats that really helped us understand how occupational therapists are embedded and implicated in the systems through which they work. And so I know already you've talked a little bit about your experiences in the mental health arena, but what are some examples from your own research about how discretion sort of manifests and is wielded in the work that you've done?
Yeah, so, and I'm going to really refer to a lot of clinical examples here, actually. So, and I'm going to refer to it implicitly and explicit in terms of implicit and explicit policies. So, before I got my doctorate, I was working, during it, I was working at Central Regional Hospital, which is an inpatient chronic mental health setting, where people are there for like at least a few months. Some people have been there their entire lives. When I was there, somebody had graduated. They were admitted as a child. They graduated to the geriatric, which is, an injustice and a horrible thing, right? So when you're functioning in those big institutions, I love this term of street level bureaucrats, because I think OTs are absolutely that. Occupational justice operatives, whatever you want to call it. It's the same thing, in my opinion. But your OTs are the ones who are pushing against these institutions and these restrictions, because we're the ones that see what it does, when you restrict that occupation, what it does to a person. So we're the ones usually that are like, wait, this is not right. And then so you have that like understanding the wait, this is not right. You need to do something about it. So at Central Regional Hospital, everyone was, locked behind doors. There was almost nothing to do. There was a whole group there that spoke Spanish that never got to do anything. And in fact, Spanish was like their third language. Most of them were speaking indigenous languages. I was the only OT that could speak Spanish. So I started working with this group, and I realized that they just needed to get out. I mean, wow. It was a really important thing to do. And I got a lot of pushback on getting people out of the hospital, because hospitals, as y'all know, are very risk averse. And the majority of their policies are around risk management and so that someone doesn't get hurt on their watch. So there's a lot of good reason for that, but then it creates horrible situations after. So I embarked on organizing a fishing trip with this group of 5 guys who basically didn't get to do anything. I remember the World Cup was on at that time. They were totally interested, but they never got to watch it because they couldn't speak and advocate for themselves there. It was very infuriating. So then we created this trip together, and I had to get, doctor's orders for every single person. There was so much red tape to navigate, stuff that was in place to discourage you from doing it, to make you not do it. But that is not what we do as OTs and as street level bureaucrats. I kept pushing, organize it. It was so hard to get it done. But then when we did it, we went out there, we cooked together, we ate together, we fished together. We didn't catch much. It was like these little fish. But then we got home, to the hospital, we call it that. And I'll never forget this. After, returning folks to their units, and I was walking down the hallway, and this nurse chased me down after, and she's like, "What did you do? I can't believe this. What did you do?" he's talking like he's never talked before. It's because he had something to talk about. He just had like a real occupational experience, which was completely different than what he was living day to day. It was such a watershed moment for me in realizing this kind of street level bureaucracy. So I continued doing that in a Wakebrook Hospital in acute psychiatric settings. I kept working on things like employment, despite the fact that the team was like, what are you doing working on employment? This guy's never going to have a job. Look how sick he is. They're wrong though, because they always saw people at their sickest. So they thought that, but they were wrong. People could get jobs. And so by even working on it was treating the person like a human with dignity. And that in of itself, even if the person never had a job, was able to get a job at the end, they still felt human and dignified in that moment. And that's part of that. Again, pushing back against these unsaid policies that are all about risk management. So, I kept doing this in the in community settings. Right now, what we're struggling with when I'm doing my consultations is there's a push to get people in the least restrictive environment. And there's also a pushback from the care providers because they're worried about both safety and risk management. And so can't live independently because they don't know how to do this particular health issue. It's dangerous. We shouldn't let them do it. So then we want to keep them in independent care, which is a horrible injustice and not right. So a lot of the discretion I'm doing here is trying to convince providers and their team leads that, no, we can do this safely. It just takes the right kind of support. So it's pushing back against these unsaid policies. Then I had the wonderful opportunity to work on the career profile for the state for all IPS teams. This is a really cool thing. And this is a moment where I got to do the explicit discretion. And I knew how important sensory processing was for this group. I'll bore you another day about all the neuroscience and details, but basically we really need to be attending to sensory processing for this group. And it was completely absent from any documents, yet here I was able to get it into this career profile. They of course cut it back after, but it's still there. And the rest of it's in the appendix, but it's still there and it's guiding people to attend to it. And so that's a major win. And that's the kind of stuff that all of us OTs can do because we're shedding light on something that other people don't necessarily see. And it's that occupational science approach, I think. So, the most concrete example that we commonly come across with is negotiating how much somebody can work and still maintain their SSDI benefits. If you make too much money, you lose that benefit and then you're still not making enough. So it's like this negotiation of what the policy is, and everybody does it. All the supported employment folks do it. You just make sure the person's working enough so that they can still get that benefit, because without it, there's no way they could survive, even if they had a 40-hour a week job. So Becky, I know that this is an integral thing that you've encountered a lot in your work in terms of SSDI benefits and the negotiation. I'd love to hear about it.
So I think the thing that really drove me to look from this idea of discretion and street level bureaucracy to a broader level of how can we wield discretion in ways that can make shifts like what you described, is this notion of being activated but stuck. And so this is something that's come out of research around long-term unemployment. And a lot of our research has shown, again, people engage in resource seeking for survival, and there are different kinds of benefits and different levels of eligibility for each of those kinds of benefits. And these kinds of benefits are often made available based on a threshold. So if you make too much money, you don't qualify for some. And if you don't make enough money, you don't qualify for others. And they're cutoff points. So there's no gradation, there's no transition. It's just on or off for these kinds of benefits. And so a lot of the things that people shared in terms of changes to their lives was that they would be doing all the right things that all of these policies said that they had to do to maintain their eligibility to meet these criteria, but they were still stuck. They were remaining stuck in their situation or in their lives. And so I want to show you an example of what this sort of looked like in our research, but this term activation or activated but stuck, that's really referring to at the policy level, people are activated to be responsible for themselves. And I'm using air quotes very intentionally here, right? Because that is a position that we can agree with or disagree with or rethink. So I want to tell you again a story of someone who shared what it was like to be activated but stuck in her circumstances. So this is a messy situational map. This was part of our data analysis from this study. So Michelle, whose map this is, was a 47-year-old female. She was attending drug and vocational rehabilitation to, quote, conquer all my demons and do what I need to do today. So she indicated that these programs helped her get the strength to go out and look for a job after having a period of incarceration 3 times over the previous 14 years. And she described being stuck in a pattern of struggling to find work, then getting stressed, then ending up taking temp work to get the resources that were required that she needed to care for herself and her child. So she said, if I go out and look, I would get discouraged and I would say, forget it, this isn't working. So I go work for a temp service. And sometimes I might work for 6 weeks straight and then might be off for 2 weeks. You know, it was back and forth. I want a full-time job or permanent job where I know I have a paycheck coming in to take care of my bills and my child and myself. And so when we were trying to understand Michelle's situation through this map, we can see that there are a lot of situational factors that contributed to her stuckness. She saw that she could switch from service sector work to health sector jobs, and that would be a potential way to get out of the cycle of temp work that she was stuck in. And she wanted to complete her high school equivalency as a means of becoming a certified nursing assistant. However, attending GED classes conflicted with her drug rehabilitation program's expectation that she be actively looking for and willing to accept any type of job that was available. So she noted, I want to go into the medical field, but I can't go until I get a GED. I can't get a GED and try to find work at the same time. Plus I have my treatment. That's too much. So Michelle's stuckness was also perpetuated by these broader social and economic factors. She was not eligible for food stamps due to the felony conviction on her record, and she was only able to afford a small apartment with limited available public transportation nearby. And she said, it's hard because there's really not a lot of jobs in the city. Most of them are far away, where some buses don't run or they stop running at a certain time. Michelle also wanted assistance to deal with stress and depression, and she saw those both as impeding her ability to work and putting her at risk of drug use. And she said, I'm trying to stay somewhere in the middle above that because sometimes that does get kind of hectic because I'm trying to find a job, I'm trying to do my treatment, I'm trying to take care of my child, I'm trying to take care of my home, and sometimes I get stressed out. So she had a really complex situation, and this work first mandate, accept any job that's available as soon as it's available. Doesn't matter if it's actually a sustainable way out of your situation. That mandate and the benefit restrictions she faced made Michelle stuck in her overall life situation. And so these kinds of findings really sensitize me to the importance of understanding how social support systems are structured, how decisions about those structures are made, and how people can use discretion to change those structures from the inside. And I'm curious from your work, how you have seen people sort of start to move forward differently to make some of those structural changes when they have this awareness, when they focused on the possibility that these are the structures that are impeding occupations and growth.
Yeah. So my work with the Center for Excellence in Community Mental Health has really evolved over the years. So the first time we got that HomeLink grant, we created a clinical team to provide the outreach, this sort of outreach. And the clinical team was led, this is traditional. I was not acting with discretion. I was following unspoken policy of this is how you do this kind of work. And so I had a social worker in charge of the team. And then we had a housing specialist, and then we had a peer support specialist, which is a person with serious mental illness who has recovered and is then trained to provide support. And then an OT, of course. And so that was the first 5 years, but like during that time, things didn't feel quite right. Things felt too medical. And in my work with my partner in crime is Salva Mahadevan. He's the clinical operations director of the center. He's the co-PI on the grant. And like the more we talked about it, the more we realized, why are we going into this medical model again? We know it doesn't work. Everything we're doing at the center is against that. And so what ended up happening is, the light was shed on the need to demedicalize. And so then it became like a really explicit thing. And it became something that I started talking about nonstop, and that Tava was all about as well. And so then the next iteration of the team, Our team lead is a peer sports specialist. Our housing specialist is a peer sports specialist, and our employment specialist is a peer sports specialist. The team is entirely led by peers. And then we're contracting out with OT. And so like there was a big shift there. And because we were both essentially occupying this position of power, we had this amazing opportunity to wield discretion and to create these interventions that are now funded by the federal government that we're trying to do to show as examples that then other people can replicate and scale up. And we are unapologetically and radically focused on belonging and social inclusion and participation and not a medical approach. So we're being very explicit about it. So, our team is peer led. We have the farm at Penny Lane, which very much embraces this clubhouse model where you don't know who's, actually staff there and who's somebody with mental illness. Everyone's doing it together and you just can't tell. And then we have this bed and breakfast on the farm. It's just a house with a peer living in it. And it's a place that people like to call in the medical community a medical respite. And it's a place, when it's medical respite, there's all these policies and someone goes there and you have to obey by all these rules. And it feels like, you've got all these clinicians coming in and, just like hospital light. But we're calling it a bed and breakfast. And because it's a place where somebody can come and just get a moment of well-being, maybe experience some stability before they end up in the hospital, or maybe they get out of the hospital and they just need a little bit more support, not quite ready to get back in the community, so they have this bed and breakfast to go to. I love this this thing. So we're starting to develop protocols a little bit behind it, but really not making it medically focused. Same thing with our food truck. It's not a food truck. It's not a typical thing. We have this this van that we have bought with a donation from Wake County. And what we're doing is we're filling it up with food that we're going to deliver to people. So we're going to go to homeless encampments. We're going to go to other places serving folks who are homeless. And what we're going to do is we use it as an engagement tool. So we're going to have all this food here, and then we're explicitly, again, talking non-medical. We're going to have maybe music, maybe even create a festive atmosphere, and then sort of offer services on the side if you want them, very discreetly on the side. So again, not medical. Then we have the Center for Living Skills and Inclusion that we've created, which is essentially just this RV that is equipped just as a regular RV, and we're going to use it to hopefully do some kind of interesting screens and interventions, maybe that don't feel clinical. Again, that's the big piece. And the thing I'm really excited about that I'm pushing most is this pavilion that's built on the farm. So NC State collaborated with the farm to build this beautiful pavilion that is used for group therapy, right? It's this really cool opportunity. This is my next project, is I want to bring music out there, a band, local band, and have it and advertise it in a way that you have, the community coming out, and then you have people who are living there, being served there as well, come out. And so everybody can be in a shared space together where you have an occupation that brings people together, like music, that people can be together in a common space and realize, wait, we're not so different actually. So folks with serious mental illness can feel included, people who are there who may not have mental illness, may experience people with mental illness for the first time and see like, wait a minute, all this culture that's telling me to be scared of these folks, well, actually, they're really fun. And I can learn a lot from them. And so like creating that shared space, that may be third place, I think is really like kind of the way we want to go next. So, zooming out even more, thinking about how does occupational justice and play into all this idea of seeing things that you can't unsee. And that's kind of like the undercurrent theme right here. Occupational justice allowed me to see these structures that affected people's participation. And I couldn't unsee that, right? So once you can't unsee it, then this justice is there. So then you are either complicit in reproduction of the systems, structures, and policies, ways of doing that reproduce those inequities. So then you're complicit, or you try to contest instead of reproducing. And that's not easy either. But guess what? If you can't unsee it, you have to contest it. So you have all of a sudden this moral imagination where you see these possibilities, these different possibilities, and it is your duty, I would argue, to act on that. Otherwise, you're perpetuating occupational injustice and inequity. So can you unsee what you have seen? No, you cannot. So Dr. Aldrich and I, through our collaborations, we really tried to bring the idea of occupational justice down to the world. The everyday. It was such a macro concept that felt really inaccessible to a lot of folks. There was even research with practitioners who were saying, yeah, this is a really cool concept, but it's for people working with refugees, it's people working in prisons, we're working with really disadvantaged folks. But our argument, and we developed this in this chapter right here, check it out, was that, this is something that everyone needs to be paying attention to. It's actually part of everyday practice. And then through the doctoral work, I had taught a doctoral class here when I was still here, focused on occupational justice. And we ended up really deepening this kind of practical application of it. And in this article right here, we really talked about how it can be done at the micro level, at the meso level, so more organizational level, and then also how it can be done at the macro level. Is to try to continue to dispel the myth that people, that regular occupational therapists can't do this work. Yes, they can. Yes, they should. Yes, they are street level bureaucrats. Yes, they are occupational justice operatives. So let's keep going. And then the most recent work I did on this is the latest chapter in Willard and Spackman that just came out. And so there I kind of deepened some other ideas related to it. But I'm bringing this one up to highlight this quote here, which I think is really, speaking to it. It's like, by encouraging OT practitioners to consider power structures and systemic factors that affect participation, an occupational justice perspective enhances a practitioner's understanding of their client's situation and expands the range of intervention targets that could be identified to support their participation. So it's really enhancing practice, and it's focusing on the wholeness of the situation, which now is time for me to pass it back to you, because I know your work focuses deeply on understanding the situation of your client.
Yeah, and I think, we, as expected, we are running short on time. So I'm going to philosophize really fast. But really, I think the nice thing about a talk like this is it gives you an opportunity to reflect on what you've done to date. And I really realize that so much of my work, and really a lot of your work as well, focuses on folks in situations of uncertainty. And it's looking at that level of situation that really helps us see these possibilities for change. So John Dewey believed that uncertainty was a central feature of experience. It's not good or bad, it just is. It's just there. And if we try to pretend that it isn't there, that we can actually have certainty in everyday life, we're not going to come up with solutions to problematic situations that are actually workable in experience. So kind of building on this idea that uncertainty is always part of the world, uncertainty is also the key to freedom and growth, because if this world was certain, it would be fixed. We couldn't be free and we couldn't grow. And so I've really been inspired to relook at this part of Dewey's work, because this allows for what Kondaki referred to as soothing the pains of the world, if we actually attend to the uncertainty in experience. So when I think about uncertainty and uncertain situations, the other part of Dewey's work that I like to think about is his work on associated living, which is connected to a lot of the conversations around occupational justice. And in short, Dewey really says that all of us are living in and dependent on the same precarious context. But there are certain people who are forced to deal with situations that have more uncertainty as an inherent element of them. And often those people have to do that a lot more than some other people. And Dewey really calls us to, and calls philosophers, but I think also we can heed this call to reconstruct conditions of association, the relations that bind us all, away from conditions that generate insecurity for select groups and people, and toward conditions that generate security for the many. So this kind of brings us back to where we started in terms of thinking about how occupational science allows us to see certain things. Dr. Bailliard talked about not being able to unsee things. And I think that's certainly been my experience, that once I was attuned to resource seeking, to street level bureaucracy, to being activated but stuck, and to thinking about who has to navigate lots of uncertainty and who doesn't. These are the things that I keep carrying forward with me in my work as an occupational scientist and thinking about how we can make inroads as occupational therapists.
Absolutely. And so, the uncertainty message, it's the world is under constant construction, right? That was the quote that was there. And so like, it's really important to think about this as an opportunity and now an obligation because you can't unsee it. That if the world is under constant construction, you're reconstructing things every day, then you are constructing the world. So you can make changes that actually have significant impacts. You don't need to reproduce what's there. And, that is part of what we do as OTs and as street level bureaucrats. It's that negotiation, that pushback, that embracing the uncertainty of the reconstruction of the world and maybe moving it towards a better place for us all.
So we do have some provisional discussion questions. We don't need to stick here if you don't want to. So I think maybe we'll say thank you, and then we'd love to have the conversation with you as well. Do we have time? We do. If anybody has any questions or comments?
I was curious when you were talking about sort of making things explicit, and how do you think about, you talked about resource seeking not really being in the OT practice, like what is your advice for sort of making those things explicit in OT training programs and sort of, even if it's not there, kind of teaching future OTs about those things?
That's a great question. So I think in my experience, part of it has been finding opportunities to share research with students and really make that connection between what's coming out of research and how can we think about this changing the way we approach practice at baseline. So knowing that some of our guiding documents aren't going to make some things visible and looking for that, being attuned to what are the silences, what are the absences. I know sometimes the article on resource seeking gets assigned, say, like in a qualitative research class, and maybe that's not even being geared towards students thinking about practice, but almost always the conversation that I hear students having afterwards is, now that I know to look for it, I'll see it. And so I think not being limited to what is made visible in those documents and helping future practitioners kind of go in with that disposition of what am I not seeing or what is silenced.
Yeah, and another thing is to, really emphasize a critical perspective of things. And when I say critical, right, I'm talking about more critical theory in terms of understanding that power dynamics are what create those documents, and therefore they're imperfect because they were created from a certain position. And so they reflect that position. So, and I know y'all do a great job about this at UNC, but like really sensitizing students to those things, that those documents aren't these like pristine, beautiful, perfect things to be worshipped, but they're made by humans and they're faulty, just as humans are faulty. And so sensitizing them to that, and then also encouraging students to, really reflect on their positionality in terms of what their experiences mean, in terms of how they understand their own occupations and what they think occupations are. Because, you can also protect against assumptions in terms of occupation if the students themselves understand that, wait, I don't know everything about occupation. There's so many occupations out there that I don't understand or have ever been exposed to. So then they're like just much more open to when they are exposed to something like resource seeking. They're like, oh, yeah, that's another one. I should have thought of that. As opposed to being like, well, that's not in the OTPF. It's that kind of critical perspective and sensitizing to their positionality that I think is essential to get there.
Other questions, comments? We have a young man anxious to grab the microphone. Give it to the behind you.
Oh, the great pass. That was good. Thank you. Great talk. Really appreciate it. I think one of the things that have been sticking with me since the very beginning of the discussion was this understanding of advocacy. And I think that in the OT context, a lot of that time that translates into advocacy for OT as a profession. And I think that's problematic because I think OTs as advocates for occupation should be how we kind of frame advocacy in occupational therapy programs. But I think my main question is knowing that people are going to be students, are going to be entering more traditional medical settings. How do we avoid some of the Band-Aid fixes to large macro scale problems? And I worry about the burnout of students when they get into programs that there are macro issues that they want to address, but do we have the tools for that?
I got the, yeah. And this actually came up earlier with the master's students themselves. Protecting against burnout is incredibly important because this work is really difficult. The institutions, policies, they have inertia to them. In other words, they reproduce themselves if you allow it. And so it's incredibly difficult to move that behemoth. And so you really need to give yourself understanding of what you can achieve and in the time you can achieve it. And, you know, what I love about OT is, man, there's a lot of passion out there and people are so into making those big changes. But I feel like sometimes people might shoot too high or, you know, maybe have unreasonable expectations of what they can achieve immediately. And so what I have found that has been successful for me in making changes is first of all, partnering with tons of people who are like-minded. Alone, I can only achieve so much. Together, oh my goodness, the stuff we can do. So it's not sticking with just OTs, it's finding other people in your institution that share common ideas. They're there. Yeah, look at your social workers. They're usually your best advocates and partners in this stuff. So it's like partner with those folks and then set like achievable things that matter. As at an inpatient psych at UNC, I remember I think it was Darren Peters who did some extraordinary work in getting some religious services down there. I hope I'm doing that example correctly, but there was something that he did in terms of giving access to those kinds of services that wasn't there before. That's a major intervention there. That really matters. I think like even taking the folks out to fish, I felt like that was an occupational justice intervention that mattered because I wasn't reproducing the narrative and I was showing people new possibilities. This can be done and look what it did. And I think we really need to celebrate those achievements. And if we all do things like that together, goodness, what change will we do? So maybe like it's a little bit of humility in what we can achieve and understanding that we need to partner as well to do it.
And just to add to that, I don't know that I have too much more to say, but I think the ripple effect is something that we need to talk about in the conversation. So I know in a lot of discussions I've had with students, problems seem very big. There's sometimes a feeling like, how can I be the one responsible for fixing this big issue? And I think we can be feel compelled or feel compassionate to be working toward a large issue rather than trying to solve the big issue, because it is the small everyday actions that can have then ripples, I think, throughout a system. And I also gave this example when we were speaking with the master's students earlier, but great OT, Brittany Connors, who was a student of mine at St. Louis University, talked about going into a setting where she couldn't make her work visible because of the documentation that site used. And she went to her manager and said, I can't use this. I can't show what I'm doing with this. And no one but a social worker had been hired in that position previously. And so he said, okay, show us how we should do it, make a new form. And the form worked so well that all the social workers started using it. So I think that's another way to think about that has ripple effects through an institution and through all of the different people serving people at that institution. And so maybe we can think about that, and that maybe will also reduce the burnout because we're going from aiming up here to right here together.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. I feel really inspired, and I had a feeling that was going to be what I would leave tonight feeling. So I really appreciate you leading us in this really interesting conversation that I hope when we move to our reception in a few minutes that we'll continue the conversation together. So thank you so much. And I want to thank, if we can go back to the slide, I just also want to thank the committee. So Sayoko Kawabata, who's probably out there setting up with Seth Mitchell,
and Michael Sandbay. So thank you for all of your help in pulling this event off with me. And I'm going to ask, as Michael said at the very beginning, Marlis Mitchell and her husband made a wonderful gift. However, we need to keep replenishing our funds. And so we have this opportunity to help for you to help continue to support us so we can continue to do this and other events for the community. So we'll leave that up here so you can do that. So please, yes, scan that code. Because we hope to be able to continue to do this year after year and continue to invite such remarkable scholars to inspire our community. Okay, and then lastly, if you do need to get any kind of a certificate of attendance for the evening, please go ahead and get that code. So we'll leave that up there so that you can use this for various licensure issues and various other things. So thank you for attending, and we hope that you'll join us in the lobby of Bondurant for our annual Med Deli reception and it's food time. Thank you, everybody.